The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as the holographic message played for the 700th time, and the transmission was ancient by galactic standards because it came from nearly 2 decades ago from a species that no longer existed in the galaxy. Commander Daniel Harper stood at the observation deck of the GSS Horizon, and he watched the purple nebula stretch across the viewport while his coffee had gone. Cold an hour ago, but he barely noticed because the weight of command had never felt heavier than it did now. Lieutenant Katie Morrison reported from the communication station that they were receiving another distress signal, and her voice carried the exhaustion they all felt after 3 months of deep space patrol. Daniel turned from the window, and his weathered face showed nothing of the dread pooling in his stomach, and he asked if it was the same source. Katie confirmed it was coming from the Velcros mining colony on Theta 7, and they were reporting an attack by unknown forces. The Velcros were a peaceful species, and Daniel knew them well enough because they were traders and miners who had welcomed humanity into the galactic community 15 years ago, and they were the ones who had first warned Earth about the Krath Empire's expansion into neutral territories. Daniel ordered the crew to set course for Theta 7 at maximum speed, and as the Horizon's engines hummed to life, he retreated to his quarters and accessed the classified files he had been given before departure. These files kept him awake at night because they contained the final transmission of the Zelthani people, and the Zelthani had been explorers and philosophers and poets who survived in the galaxy for over 6,000 years through diplomacy and careful neutrality. They had no standing army and no weapons of mass destruction, and no enemies until they encountered the Krath Empire. Daniel watched the recording again, and a Zelthani elder appeared on screen with her silver skin dulled by fear, and she spoke directly to the camera in perfect galactic standard. She said to all species who received this message that they must not provoke humans, and must not engage them in conflict, and must not threaten their colonies or their trade routes because the Zelthani made this mistake and now they pay the price of their ignorance. The image shifted to show burning cities and ships torn apart in orbit, and the systematic dismantling of an entire civilization across multiple worlds. The elder continued and said they believed the humans were soft because humans smiled at their jokes and traded fairly, and spoke always of peace, and the Zelthani thought them weak and harmless. When the Zelthani attacked a human research station to claim the resources in that system, they expected a diplomatic protest or perhaps a trade embargo at most. The camera shook as explosions rocked the building she was in, and she explained what they received was annihilation instead. The humans came not with warnings or negotiations, but with a fury the Zelthani could not comprehend, and they fought not as individuals, but as a single organism, and they did not retreat and did not surrender and did not forgive. The recording cut to static and then resumed with the elder's face filling the frame, and she said they sent their entire fleet to stop the humans. 3,000 ships represented the accumulated military might of 60 centuries of civilization, and the humans destroyed them all in 4 hours. The ships were not disabled or captured but completely destroyed, and the humans used weapons the Zelthani did not know existed, and tactics they could not predict, and a determination that transcended logic. Her eyes were empty now and haunted by what she had witnessed, and she explained this was their final message because they were the last of their kind. The humans had glassed 7 of their 12 worlds, and the remaining 5 had surrendered unconditionally. But it did not matter because the humans would not stop until the debt was paid in full. She warned again to not provoke humans and not make their mistake, because the price was too terrible to bear. And then the transmission ended. Daniel closed the file and stared at his reflection in the darkened screen, because he knew what most aliens did not understand about humanity. The galaxy saw humans as the friendly newcomers who were always quick with a joke, and eager to trade and passionate about cultural exchange. But what they did not see was the other side of that passion. Humanity had crawled out of a death world where everything tried to kill them, and they had survived ice ages and plagues and countless wars against themselves, and they had looked at the stars and decided that nothing would stop them from reaching them. When humans loved, they loved with every fiber of their being, and when humans fought, they fought with the same intensity. The Zelthani had learned this too late because they had mistaken kindness for weakness and paid for it with extinction. And now the Krath were making the same mistake. Daniel's communicator chimed and he tapped it, and Katie's voice came through saying they were approaching Theta 7 and he needed to see something. He made his way back to the bridge and stopped dead at what the view screen showed because the Velcros colony was in ruins. Orbital platforms burned like dying stars, and the surface was scarred with impact craters and scorched earth, but that was not what made his blood run cold. Hanging in orbit above the devastation was a Krath warfleet with 50 ships arranged in a perfect battle formation, and at the center was a massive dreadnought, displaying the banner of the Krath Emperor. Katie said quietly that they were hailing them, and Daniel told her to put it on screen. A Krath commander appeared, and his insectoid features twisted in what passed for a smile among his species, and he told the human vessel that they had entered Krath territorial space and must surrender their ship, and they would be granted the mercy of servitude. Daniel felt the familiar cold settle over him, and it was the cold that came before battle and the cold that had served him well in the border wars against the Helix Confederation. He replied that this was not Krath space, but a neutral mining colony under Galactic Council protection. The Krath commander's mandibles clicked in amusement, and he said the Council held no power there anymore because the Krath Empire expands and the weak fall before them, and the human species had grown soft with peace, and they would learn to kneel or learn to die. Daniel glanced at his tactical officer, Lieutenant Greg Fisher, who gave a subtle nod because the Horizon might be a science and exploration vessel, but like all human ships, it was armed far beyond what its classification suggested. Daniel said calmly that he needed to tell the commander something, and something their intelligence division apparently failed to mention. The Krath commander leaned forward with interest, and Daniel explained that 15 years ago, when humanity first made contact with the Galactic Council, they made a choice to show the galaxy their best side. They decided to show their curiosity and creativity and desire for peace, and they put their scientists and diplomats at the forefront, and they smiled and traded and learned from other species. Daniel's expression hardened, and he said they never forgot where they came from and never forgot what they are, and they made a rule that if you harm one of them, then you harm all of them. The Krath commander's expression shifted and uncertainty crept in, and Daniel continued by saying that the commander had just destroyed a colony that had 300 human researchers working with the Velcros, and he killed them all without mercy. Daniel leaned forward in his chair and said he would tell the commander what happens next. In approximately 48 hours, the human fleet would arrive, and it would not be a patrol ship or a task force, but the entire fleet with every carrier and battleship and every piece of military hardware they had been quietly building while everyone assumed they were harmless. He stood up and said the fleet would do to the Krath what they did to the Zelthani, and they would erase the Empire so completely that in 1,000 years, the only record would be a warning beacon saying here died a species that mistook human patience for human weakness. The Krath Imperial War Council convened on the capital world of Krathis Prime within hours of receiving the transmission from Commander Harper, and the Obsidian halls echoed with the clicking mandibles of dozens of military commanders who each represented a different sector of the Empire. Supreme War Leader Zenthkal stood at the center of the circular chamber, and his crimson carapace gleamed under the harsh lights because he was old by Krath standards and had led military campaigns for 40 cycles, and his tactical brilliance was legendary among his people. He said that this human commander speaks boldly for one whose ship they could destroy in minutes, and his voice was a harsh rasp that carried authority throughout the chamber. General Vexnor, who commanded the Third Fleet, stepped forward and asked permission to engage and destroy the human vessel because they should make an example of their arrogance. Zenthkal raised a claw for silence and said no, because he wanted to understand what they faced first, and told them to bring everything they knew about humanity's military capabilities. A junior intelligence officer named Sylvan approached nervously and activated the holographic display, and images of human ships filled the chamber with sleek vessels that seemed more suited to exploration than warfare. Sylvan began explaining that the humans entered galactic society 15 years ago, and they possessed approximately 200 registered vessels, and most were classified as research or cargo or diplomatic ships. Their registered military consisted of 23 patrol craft and 7 system defense platforms around their core worlds. Vexnor scoffed and said 23 ships when the Krath had 3,000 ships. Zenthkal ordered Sylvan to continue, and the officer explained that human technology was considered adequate, but not exceptional, with standard fusion drives and plasma weapons and kinetic barriers. The humans had contributed significantly to scientific research, but had shown little interest in military expansion, according to all records. Zenthkal asked about ground forces, and Sylvan said they were minimal because humans maintained what they called a peacekeeping corp numbering approximately 50,000 individuals, and they claimed it was purely defensive. Zenthkal studied the data and his tactical mind analyzed every detail, but something bothered him though he could not identify what it was. He asked about their history before spaceflight, and Sylvan hesitated before answering. The information was less clear because the humans were reluctant to discuss their pre-contact history in detail, but what they knew suggested a fractured species with numerous internal conflicts. Zenthkal asked if they had wars, and Sylvan confirmed there were many apparently, but the humans achieved planetary unity approximately 70 years ago and claimed to have moved beyond such primitive behaviors. Vexnor clicked his mandibles in amusement and said they evolved past war, which was impossible, because war was the natural state of all intelligent life. Zenthkal was not so sure, and he pulled up another file that had been sitting in intelligence archives and was largely ignored. He asked about the Zelthani incident, and the chamber went silent because the destruction of the Zelthani civilization had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, but most species had accepted the official story about a tragic accident involving experimental weapons that got out of control. Sylvan read from the file that the Zelthani attacked a human research station 20 years ago, and 37 humans died, and the human response was swift and overwhelming, and the Zelthani civilization collapsed within weeks. Zenthkal pressed and asked if it collapsed or was destroyed, and Sylvan said the reports were unclear and the humans claimed they were simply defending their territory, and the Galactic Council accepted their explanation. A new voice spoke from the shadows and said it was because they were terrified, and everyone turned to see Intelligence Director Calthix emerge from the observation gallery. His ancient body was scarred from countless battles, and his presence commanded immediate respect. Zenthkal acknowledged him and asked if he had information, and Calthix said he had the truth which no one wanted to hear. The old director activated his personal data crystal, and a new set of images appeared, and what the council saw made even the most battle-hardened warriors recoil. The images showed planets stripped of all life and cities, reduced to fused glass, and ships not merely destroyed but atomized, and most disturbing were images of Zelthani refugees, who had survived, and their eyes held a terror that transcended species barriers. Calthix said quietly that the humans did not simply defend themselves, but committed what they called total war. They did not stop at military targets but systematically destroyed every Zelthani military installation and every industrial center and every government building, and they gave the Zelthani exactly one chance to surrender. Zenthkal asked if the Zelthani refused, and Calthix said no, because they accepted immediately and unconditionally. But it did not matter. The chamber erupted in confused clicks and hisses because this made no sense to them. Calthix explained that the humans continued the assault for 3 more days after the surrender, because they wanted to ensure the Zelthani would never possess the capability to threaten them again. By the time they stopped, the Zelthani civilization had been reduced from a spacefaring empire to a collection of farming communities under strict human oversight. Zenthkal felt a chill run through his body and asked why this information was suppressed. Calthix explained that the Galactic Council was terrified of what it meant because the humans had shown themselves capable of genocide within hours of arriving in the galactic community. But then they smiled and offered trade agreements and acted as if nothing had happened. The council chose to believe the humans had learned their lesson and that they would be peaceful partners. Calthix said he had advised the council to study humanity more carefully and to understand what kind of species could switch from friendship to annihilation so quickly, but they ignored him because they wanted to believe the pleasant fiction. Vexnor demanded to know why he was telling them this now, and Calthix said it was because they were about to make the same mistake the Zelthani made. They were about to learn that humans did not fight the way other species did, and they did not seek honor in battle, and did not follow the established rules of galactic warfare, but they fought to win, and they defined winning as the complete elimination of the threat. Zenthkal studied the data again, and his mind raced with the implications, and he asked how many humans died in their attack on the Velcros colony. Sylvan said 300, and Zenthkal asked about the Zelthani incident and was told 37. The math was simple and terrifying because if the humans scaled their response proportionally, then the Krath Empire was facing an existential threat. Zenthkal said they needed to verify this information and told them to contact their intelligence operatives near human space because he wanted confirmation of their fleet movements. 30 minutes later, the reports started coming in and every human ship in the galaxy was moving toward Velcro space. It was not just military vessels, but everything, because cargo ships were being retrofitted with weapons and civilian transports were being converted into troop carriers, and mining vessels were being loaded with military-grade explosives. From Earth itself, a fleet was emerging that nobody knew existed, and Vexnor whispered that they lied because they told the Council they had 23 military vessels. Sylvan confirmed with a shaking voice that they had 223 battleships and carriers and dreadnoughts that were all hidden in orbital platforms that everyone thought were commercial shipyards. The holographic display updated with ship classifications, and the Council members felt their confidence crumble completely. The humans had built a war fleet in secret, and they had spent 15 years smiling and trading while constructing enough military might to challenge any empire in the galaxy. Admiral Linda Carter stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance, which was humanity's flagship, and she watched the tactical display update with the positions of the fleet now under her command. 219 warships surrounded her vessel in perfect formation, and they represented the culmination of 15 years of secret military development. She was 63 years old and a veteran of the border wars that had nearly torn Earth apart before unification, and she had been waiting for this moment with a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction. Captain Henry Brooks announced from the command station beside her that all ships reported ready, and they could jump to Theta 7 on her order. Linda nodded slowly, and her eyes remained on the display because each point of light represented a ship filled with thousands of personnel who were all ready to enforce what she had come to think of as humanity's first rule. The rule was simple and brutal because it said, "Do not start a fight with us, but if you do, then we will finish it completely." She asked about the status of civilian mobilization, and Henry said 37 cargo vessels had been converted to support ships, and 12 mining platforms were now carrying orbital bombardment packages, and they had enough firepower to glass a dozen worlds. Linda said that was good and asked about diplomatic channels. Commander Lisa Huang, who was her senior diplomatic officer, stepped forward with a datapad and said the Galactic Council had sent 14 messages demanding they show restraint. The Velcros government had begged them not to respond with excessive force, and 6 neutral species had offered to mediate, and the Krath Empire had offered reparations and unconditional surrender. Linda raised an eyebrow and asked if they offered unconditional surrender before the human fleet had even arrived. Lisa confirmed it and said apparently their intelligence division finally did their homework because they knew about the Zelthani incident now. Linda felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders, because the Zelthani incident was humanity's greatest shame and its most effective deterrent. When she had been a junior officer, she had participated in that campaign, and the memories still haunted her dreams every night. She asked what the Krath were offering, and Lisa said they offered financial compensation to the families of those killed, and withdrawal from all disputed territories, and they wanted to negotiate a non-aggression pact. Linda said no firmly, and the bridge crew looked at her in surprise. Lisa asked carefully if she was sure, and Linda said she was certain because the Krath did not get to murder 300 of their people and then buy their way out of consequences. She told Lisa to send a message to the Council that humanity would accept nothing less than complete and verified disarmament of the Krath military. They could keep system defense forces, but their attack fleet would be dismantled under human supervision. Lisa said that was asking them to effectively end their empire, and Linda replied coldly that they should not have attacked a human colony then. She turned to face her crew and said she knew some of them thought they were being excessive and that they should show mercy and be the bigger species and accept the Krath surrender. She said she would tell them why that was not going to happen, and pulled up an image on the main screen. It showed a young woman, maybe 30 years old, with kind eyes and a bright smile. Linda said this was Dr. Susan Palmer, who was a xenobiologist at the Velcros colony, and she spent 5 years studying microbial life in extreme environments. She discovered 3 new species of bacteria that could potentially revolutionize medical treatment across the galaxy. Another image appeared, and Linda said this was Jacob Mills, who was an engineer specialized in sustainable habitat design. He was helping the Velcros develop new mining techniques that would not damage their environment, and he had a wife and 2 children on Earth. More images flashed across the screen faster now, and Linda named them one by one. Dr. Alex Turner was a mathematician, and Professor Helen Wright was a linguist, and Lieutenant Commander Peter Grant was a security officer. 300 names and 300 people who went to that colony to help and to learn and to build bridges between human species and others. Linda's voice hardened, and she said the Krath killed them all without warning and without mercy and without justification. They did it because they thought humans were weak, and because they looked at human diplomats and scientists and assumed that was all humanity was. She turned back to the tactical display and said no, because they would not accept a simple surrender and would not let the Krath pay blood money and walk away. They would show the entire galaxy what happens when you mistake human kindness for human weakness. Henry reported quietly that the fleet was ready to jump, and Linda told him to take them to Theta 7. She also told him to send a message to the Krath Emperor that said humanity remembers. The fleet vanished in a brilliant flash of faster-than-light travel, and 20 hours later they emerged into normal space at the edge of the Theta 7 system. The sight that greeted them made even the most hardened veterans pause, because the Velcros colony was worse than the initial report suggested. Orbital platforms had been deliberately targeted, and their debris created a deadly field around the planet. The surface showed signs of atmospheric bombardment that had ignited fires across 3 continents. Linda asked quietly about casualty estimates and was told 300 humans were confirmed dead and approximately 15,000 Velcros were killed in the initial attack, and unknown numbers were dead from secondary effects. Linda closed her eyes briefly and then opened them with renewed purpose. She told Tactical to scan for any Krath ships in the system and was told the system was clear, but they were detecting a large fleet grouping approximately 3 light-years away. The fleet appeared to be waiting, and Linda asked how many ships there were. The answer came that there were 2,843 ships, and it was the bulk of the Krath military. The bridge fell silent because the Krath had assembled their entire fleet and positioned it just beyond the system as a show of force, or perhaps a last line of defense. Linda studied the tactical data, and her strategic mind analyzed the situation carefully. 2,000 ships against her 200 meant that on paper, it should be an impossible fight, but humans had never fought on paper. She told communications that she wanted an open channel to the Krath fleet and the Galactic Council, and told them to broadcast on all frequencies. The communication officer confirmed the channel was open, and Linda took a breath. She spoke with the full weight of Earth's military authority behind her words, and said she was Admiral Linda Carter of the United Nations Space Command. 15 days ago, the Krath Empire attacked a peaceful colony and murdered 300 human citizens along with 15,000 Velcros, and the Krath Supreme War Leader had offered surrender and reparations. She paused and let the weight of her next words settle, and said she was rejecting that offer. Across the galaxy, species listened with growing alarm, and Linda continued. The Galactic Council would tell her to show restraint, and they would remind her that humans were a young species and should follow established protocols for conflict resolution. They would tell her that mercy was the mark of an advanced civilization, but mercy had a price. That price was paid by the next species the Krath attacked, because they would be confident that they faced no real consequences for their actions. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so crowded. Before, and representatives from 73 species packed the observation galleries, while the primary council members sat in tense silence around the central podium. The holographic display showed the Theta 7 system, which was now peaceful but forever changed by what had happened there. Ambassador Jeffrey Coleman stood at the human delegation station, and he felt the weight of thousands of alien eyes upon him. At 45 years old, he had been Earth's chief diplomat for only 2 years, and now he faced the most critical moment in human-alien relations since first contact. Council Speaker Vothran was a tall, crystalline being whose species had founded the Council 5,000 years ago, and he activated the proceedings with a resonant chime. The Council recognized Ambassador Coleman, and Vothran said the human actions at Theta 7 had caused considerable concern among member species, and Coleman would need to explain. Jeffrey took a steadied breath and said the explanation was simple, because the Krath Empire attacked a peaceful colony and murdered 300 human citizens, and humanity responded proportionally. The word proportionally came from Ambassador Kellis, who represented the Helix Confederation, and her reptilian features twisted in what might have been disgust or fear. She said that humans forced an empire of 40 billion beings into complete military surrender and dismantled a fleet that took them 2 centuries to build. and asked how he called this proportional. Jeffrey said yes calmly, and explained that the Krath attacked without provocation and without mercy, and they killed civilians who posed no threat. The proportional response was to ensure they never had the capability to do so again. Council Speaker Vothran said that humans had set a dangerous precedent because the Galactic Council existed to mediate conflicts peacefully, and humans ignored their protocols. Jeffrey said with respect that the Council's protocols failed because the Velcros filed 17 complaints about Krath aggression before the attack, and the Council did nothing. Humanity acted to protect not just human people but all species threatened by Krath expansion. A ripple of conversation spread through the chamber, and several smaller species exchanged glances. Jeffrey noticed that not all the attention was hostile, because some species looked at humanity with something that might have been hope. Ambassador Thelkor of the Kixian Assembly stood up, and his avian features ruffled with agitation. He said the human defense fleet contained 219 warships, and humans told the Council they possessed 23 patrol vessels and accused them of lying. Jeffrey corrected him and said no, because they told the Council what they had registered for patrol duties and never claimed that was their full military capacity. In fact, they registered those ships exactly as specified by Council regulations, and the other species assumed humans had no other vessels because they wanted to believe humans were harmless. Thelkor snapped that it was semantics, and Jeffrey countered that it was survival. His species learned long ago that showing all your capabilities invites aggression, and they built a defense fleet while maintaining a friendly diplomatic presence, and it was called prudent strategy. Ambassador Kellis interjected that it was called deception, and Jeffrey turned to face her directly. He asked her to tell him how many military vessels the Helix Confederation possessed, and she hesitated. She said their military capacity was classified, and Jeffrey said exactly because every species in this chamber maintained secrets about their defensive capabilities. Humanity was simply being honest about it now that they had been forced to reveal themselves. Council Speaker Vothran raised a crystalline appendage for silence and said the issue was not deception, but the extreme nature of the human response. The Krath offered surrender before the human fleet arrived, and humans rejected it and forced complete disarmament, and this went beyond defense. Jeffrey pulled up a holographic display that showed the ruins of the Velcros colony and said he wanted every member of this council to look at these images and really look at them. The display cycled through scenes of devastation with burned cities and shattered orbital platforms and mass graves, where Velcros and humans had been buried together. Jeffrey said the Krath did not just attack a colony, but committed a massacre because they targeted civilian infrastructure deliberately and used atmospheric weapons that caused fires across 3 continents. 15,000 Velcros died, along with the 300 human citizens. His voice hardened, and he asked where the Council was when this was happening and where were the peacekeeping forces and the sanctions and the consequences. Silence greeted his questions, and he said he would tell them where they were because the answer was nowhere. The Krath were powerful, and the Council was afraid to act, and so humanity acted instead, and now the Council was afraid of humans, Council Speaker Vothran said quietly, and surprised everyone with his honesty that yes, they were afraid. The human species had shown a capacity for violence that exceeded anything they had seen in millennia, and the Zelthani incident was shocking, enough but to repeat such actions suggested that humanity viewed total war as an acceptable solution. Jeffrey felt the moment shift because this was the real concern and the truth beneath all the diplomatic language. He said softly that humans did not view total war as acceptable, but viewed it as horrible and tragic, and something to be avoided at almost any cost. He gestured to the chamber around them and said for 15 years humans worked peacefully alongside all of them, and shared technology and art and culture. They made friends and built trade relationships and did this because they wanted to be part of this community and wanted to prove that humanity could move beyond its violent past. Ambassador Kellis asked with genuine confusion in her voice why they reacted so extremely then. Jeffrey replied that it was because of the word almost, because humans would avoid war at almost any cost, but not at the cost of their people's lives, and not when the price of peace was letting others murder them without consequence. He pulled up another image, and this one showed a human family. Jeffrey said this was his brother, Carl, who was an engineer at the Velcros colony, and he had a wife, Nicole, who was a teacher there, and they had a 6-year-old daughter named Emma. Jeffrey's voice remained steady, but Emotion crept through as he explained that Emma survived the attack because she was in a bunker when the bombardment started. She watched her parents die, and she was 6 years old and would never forget the day aliens fell from the sky and murdered her family. The chamber was absolutely silent now, and Jeffrey asked them to look into that little girl's eyes and tell him what an appropriate response would be. He asked them to tell him what price should be paid for her trauma and how many credits it took to buy forgiveness for her loss. Jeffrey turned slowly and made eye contact with as many representatives as possible. He said every species in this chamber had experienced violence and they all knew loss, but somehow they had convinced themselves that the civilized response was to absorb the blow and accept compensation and move on. Maybe that worked for them, but humans remembered everything, because they remembered every slight and every betrayal and every act of violence against them, and they taught their children to remember too. Ambassador Thelkor said nervously that it sounded like a threat, and Jeffrey said it was not a threat but information. Humanity would be their friend and their trading partner and their ally in times of need. But if anyone crossed them or harmed their people, then humans would respond with everything they had. 3 years after the Theta 7 incident, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Morrison stood on the observation deck of the UNS Guardian and watched a diplomatic summit unfold on the planet below. She was the daughter of Katie Morrison, who had served with Daniel Harper on that fateful day when the Krath attacked, and she carried her mother's legacy with both pride and burden. The summit was historic because 57 species had gathered on the neutral world of Sanctuary to sign the Galactic Accord on human integration. Rachel's presence here was symbolic and represented the new generation of humans who would shape the future of human-alien relations. Captain Sam Wright joined her at the viewport and said it was an impressive sight. He was in his early 50s and a diplomatic corps officer who had spent the last 3 years helping navigate the complex aftermath of human military action. Rachel corrected him and said it was intimidating because 57 species were all here, because they were afraid of humans. Sam pointed out that they were afraid enough to negotiate, and that was progress. Below them, the summit hall gleamed like a jewel on the planet's surface, and inside, Ambassador Jeffrey Coleman was delivering his final address before the signing ceremony. Rachel asked if they should go down, and Sam said in a few minutes because he wanted to talk to her first, away from the crowds and cameras. Rachel turned to face him with curiosity, and Sam asked if her mother told her about the Horizon's confrontation with the Krath fleet. Rachel said her mother told her every detail and said it was the scariest moment of her life. Sam asked if her mother told her what happened after, and Rachel shook her head. Sam pulled up a holographic display showing casualty figures and economic data and political analyses. He said the Theta 7 incident changed the galaxy in ways they were still discovering, because the Krath Empire collapsed within 18 months. It was not because of the military restrictions humans imposed, but because their subject species saw what happened and decided they did not need to be afraid anymore. The display showed a cascading series of independence movements across former Krath territory, and Sam explained that 23 worlds declared independence. The Krath central government tried to suppress the rebellions but could not do so without their military, and within a year the Krath Empire had fractured into 16 independent systems. Rachel asked quietly if that was their fault, and Sam said that was the question humanity had been asking itself. Humans destroyed the Krath military to protect themselves and did not intend to cause the Empire's collapse, but intentions did not change outcomes. The display shifted to show refugee movements and economic disruption and humanitarian crises. Sam said 400 million Krath became refugees and 12 newly independent worlds lacked the infrastructure to support themselves. Humanity had to decide whether to walk away and let them deal with the consequences or help rebuild what they helped break. Rachel asked what humans did, and Sam said they did everything they could because they sent aid and engineers and medical teams. They helped mediate disputes between the new governments and became peacekeepers in a region they had just destabilized. Sam closed the display and said that was the part people did not talk about when they discussed the Theta 7 incident. People remembered the fleet and the forced surrender and the military dominance, but they forgot that humans spent 3 years and billions of credits helping the Krath rebuild. Rachel asked why he was telling her this, and Sam said it was because she was going down to that summit to witness history, but she needed to understand what that history meant. Humanity proved they could destroy their enemies, and now they needed to prove they could do something harder. Rachel asked what that was, and Sam said it was living with the consequences. They made their way to the surface where the summit hall buzzed with activity, and Rachel had never seen so many different species in one place. The diversity was breathtaking and slightly overwhelming. Ambassador Coleman spotted them and waved them over and said the timing was good because the ceremony was about to begin. Sam asked how the mood was, and Jeffrey admitted it was complicated, because half these species were here because they genuinely wanted to build better relations with humanity. The other half were here because they were terrified of what humans would do if they were not present. Rachel said that was not sustainable, and Jeffrey agreed and said that was why today was so important. The delegates began taking their seats in the massive circular chamber, and Rachel found herself sitting between a Velcros delegate and a young Krath diplomat named Severin. The irony was not lost on her because she was sitting next to both victims and perpetrators of the original attack. Severin said nervously that she was human, and Rachel confirmed she was and said her mother served on the ship that held the Krath fleet at Theta 7. She watched his reaction carefully and expected hostility or fear, but instead she saw something more complex. Severin asked if her mother was on the horizon with Commander Harper, and Rachel said yes because she was the communications officer. Severin's mandibles clicked, and what Rachel had learned was contemplation, and he told her to tell her mother thank you. Rachel was confused and asked what he meant. Severin said thank you for the warning because his father was Supreme War Leader Zenthkal, and he told him before he died that Commander Harper gave him the only chance he would ever get to save their people. He took that chance, and it saved billions of lives. Rachel stared at the young Krath and processed this perspective because she thought he would hate humans. Severin said he did hate them for a long time, but then he watched what humans did after the war. Humans did not occupy Krath worlds and did not demand tribute, but helped them rebuild and treated their refugees and mediated their independence disputes fairly. He leaned closer and said his people spent 2 centuries building an empire through conquest and intimidation. Humans shattered it in days and then spent 3 years helping them become something better. There were Krath who would hate humans forever for destroying their power, but there were more who understood that power built on fear was never going to last. The ceremony began before Rachel could respond, and Council Speaker Vothran's crystalline form stood at the center of the chamber. His voice resonated through the hall, and he said they gathered today to formalize what had become inevitable. Humanity had proven itself a force that could not be ignored or dismissed, and the question before them was not whether to integrate humans into galactic society, but how to do so in a way that benefited all species. Jeffrey stood to represent Earth, and Rachel felt a swell of pride watching him speak. He said 3 years ago the Krath Empire attacked a peaceful colony and killed 300 human citizens, and humanity's response was swift and overwhelming and shocking to many of them. Today he wanted to address the fear that response created. He activated a holographic display showing Earth and explained this was where humans came from. It was a world that tried to kill them in every way imaginable, with predators and diseases and climate extremes and natural disasters. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity survived by being adaptable and clever, and when necessary, ruthlessly efficient at eliminating threats. The image shifted to show human cities and art and music and cultural achievements. Jeffrey said humans also survived by being social and building communities and creating beauty in a hostile universe. They survived by caring for their weak and remembering their dead, because humanity was not one thing but a paradox. They were capable of terrible violence and profound compassion, and often showed both simultaneously.